Well, good evening, everyone. And thanks for coming to this talk. How does your Gothic glow? 3 centuries of flickering flames, occult electricity, and the lure of the luminous abyss. So, what is this all about? Well, this is a kind of a sampling of some of the themes and the ideas that we're going to be exploring in my two-part class that I'll be giving at Morbid Anatomy, the Gothic Cosmos. And I'm going to teach it in 2 parts. The first part, the Gothic Cosmos Part I, Ruins, Romantics, and Revolutions of the Unreal, begins February 1st. And the second part, the Gothic Cosmos Part II, Laboratories, Labyrinths, and the Luminous Abyss, will begin, I believe, in early May. So, in tonight's talk, what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on, we're going to do a little bit of the history of the Gothic, what I mean when I say Gothic and where that comes from and how it relates to Romanticism. But thematically, I want to focus on this idea of lighting or of lights, luminosity in the Gothic. And so these sort of 3 areas that repeat over and over again, whether we're talking about Gothic literature or whether we're talking about Gothic tableau, within painting or book illustration, even theater, the flickering light, the lamp in the gloom, the chiaroscuro, shadow play, as well as this idea of electricity being connected to secret powers. And then also this idea of some kind of a luminous doorway or abyss or source, which can function sometimes as a gate to another world. That's something that you also find in later Gothic and, of course, in Romantic art and literature. And that will eventually feed into early science fiction. So, what do I have for you in this first slide? This is an image from The Legend of Croque-Mitaine by Gustave Doré, showing these mysterious figures, and it's titled The Corpse Candles. So we're going to be looking at how candlelight, moving from the the Renaissance and the Baroque period into the era of the Gothic and the Romantic, plays such an important role in scenes, particularly at night or inside castles or ruins, which heightens the dramatic action. The second image is a painting by Benjamin West in the collection, I believe, of the Smithsonian. And it's of a kind of an apotheosis of Benjamin Franklin. So he's doing his famous kite experiment. And as we go along here, we'll see how this idea of electricity, not only as a source of energy, that is part of the experiments of the early scientific revolution, but also as this kind of this romantic idea that electricity or electrical energy can generate life, comes forth, in the sort of most well-known sense in the story of Frankenstein. And I'm recording this actually on January 1st, and it was in 1818, January 1st, that Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was first published. So that's kind of an auspicious anniversary. So we're definitely going to be talking about this evening the connection of electricity in the Gothic and the Romantic period, and how that relates not only to the scientific revolution, but also to later ideas such as vitalism. And then, of course, the final image I have for you is Greg Hildebrandt, contemporary illustrator, his image of Descent into the Maelstrom by Edgar Allan Poe. And Poe is going to play an important part, mostly at the end of the lecture tonight when I'm talking about the luminous abyss. But these sort of 3 areas of luminosity and of light are really, really important if we're thinking about Gothic and Romantic literature and the way that those tropes of light play throughout the whole history of the Gothic and all of the things that come out of the Gothic. So as I say, these 3 sort of families of light phenomenon are flickering flames, candles, lamps, strange lights in the gloom, occult electricity, as I've just mentioned, so the drama also of the way that lightning shows up, as I said, in Frankenstein. But if you think about just sort of the tropes of the haunted house or any horror film. And all of these things come out of Gothic literature and dark romanticism. Bolts of lightning, the dark and stormy night, all of that is very, very much an important part of the sort of atmospheric drama, right, of Gothic art literature. And then later, of course, things like the horror film. And then, as I've said, the luminous abyss, that's a kind of a general term that I'm using for this idea of something that glows from an outer world, an underworld, or an other world. We'll see how that is such an important part, particularly in dark romanticism and in the way that the Gothic and the Romantic utilize landscape. And as we'll see later on, things that have to do with otherworldly lights. That becomes a very, very important sort of element, and certainly we'll see how that ties directly into science fiction. Okay, so this is a very short excerpt from an interesting book of essays about the Gothic as a literary movement, but also as a tradition sort of something that feeds into all of the arts. And it's a collection of essays called Exhibited by Candlelight: Sources and Developments in the Gothic Tradition. And I've juxtaposed it with this early 19th century image, figures in a ruined church by a German painter. And I don't think we know who this is, but it's certainly in the tradition of somebody like Caspar David Friedrich, who in the class we'll be talking a lot about, but who I also will be touching on in this evening's lecture. So one of the things that I want to point out as we think about how the Gothic and the Romantic relate to this idea of candlelight or of illumination from flames is that very often this is juxtaposed in night scenes with interior spaces that are either ruins. Sometimes there are also sort of natural spaces, a dark forest, rock formations, Stonehenge, things like that. But in each of these situations, and if you think about Romantic art in general, and also of Gothic literature, which is a little bit earlier, the human figure or the human subject that holds the torch, that holds the candle, is very often set within some kind of a cavernous space. The human figure is being sort of overwhelmed, right? And this idea of sort of the spatiality of the Gothic or of the Romantic in relationship to the figure and also to firelight. That's something that you will see over and over again. And if you think about something like, the Indiana Jones films or, any of your favorite horror films, the figure holding a lamp in some kind of a cavernous space, and then, the jump scare that comes after that, right? This tropology of the individual holding the light source in some kind of a mysterious environment is central. And it starts, well, I don't want to say it starts here, but certainly if we're thinking about being conscious of it as a kind of a trope in the high drama of the Gothic and the Romantic, this is where it really starts to gel and to be used over and over again in a very sort of predictable way. Okay, so let me read this for you. This is from the introduction of Exhibited by Candlelight. It may be apropos, to begin by citing Samuel Taylor Coleridge's suspicious reaction in his Table Talk to Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which we would not perceive as a Gothic text. Quote, "When I read a chapter in Gibbon, I seemed to be looking through a luminous haze or fog. Figures come and go. I know not how or why, all larger than life, or distorted and discolored. Nothing is real, vivid, true. All is scenical, and as it were exhibited by candlelight." So this is Coleridge, one of the fathers of Romanticism, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, in Xanadu did Kubla Khan. And he's talking about, the way that he is reading Gibbon, who wrote Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. So it's interesting because he's describing this very much in the way that I was just discussing this painting. the description of the past, the way that Gibbon is describing what's going on in Roman history, particularly at the end of the empire, right? We'll talk about the Goths in a minute when the Goths sack Rome. He is making the point that it seems to be, set up rather almost like a stage show. So there is this self-consciousness that's becoming more and more apparent in the Gothic and in the Romantic period, thinking through this idea of how when we talk about the past, there are ways that we're describing these things which are deeply dramatic, right? There's a kind of a scenographic science, if you will, to this. And that's why, things like the Gothic and the Romantic, we talk about them being very dramatic, right? This is not realism in the way that we think of realism. Realism is sort of, if we're thinking about rationalism and realism, the Gothic revolt and the Romantic Revolution are sort of a pushback against that. It's more complicated, but let's just put a pin in that for a second. Okay, so in keeping with this idea of the flickering candle, the illumination, right, which is sort of setting the stage for this sort of high drama, the Castle of Otranto, which is considered sort of the first great Gothic novel, is published in 1764. And we're going to talk about the author Horace Walpole and his importance, not only as kind of the father of the Gothic novel, but also as an antiquarian and as a great collector of medieval objects. And then, of course, his great architectural project, the neo-medieval Gothic Strawberry Hill. But we'll get to that in a minute. I thought it was sort of interesting when I was looking at dates here. 200 years later, in 1964, Roger Corman's Masque of the Red Death premiered. Now, I'm a huge fan of all of the Roger Corman Poe adaptations. Some of them are more campy than others. But, critics seem to agree that the Masque of the Red Death is sort of the best of all of them. And it's interesting because if you watch this film, any of the Corman Poe films, all of the tropes that we're talking about, the lightning bolt, right, outside of the castle, and then, of course, candles are central to almost all of the scenes. And so I've just, on this slide, put up for you here this image from a French edition of the Castle of Otranto, showing one of the characters holding a candle up as a skeletal specter with chains goes before them. And then, of course, Vincent Price and Jane Asher here from A Masque of the Red Death, in which Vincent Price is playing Prince Prospero, the wicked, satanic antagonist, sort of anti-hero. And something else that I find really fascinating is in all of the Corman Poe adaptations, I don't recall any plain colored candles being used. They're always colored. And of course, if you know The Masque of the Red Death, either the short story or the film or film versions of it, color plays an important part. So I just wanted to point that out. I think that's very interesting. But it's kind of funny because if you think about 1764 being the date of the publication of The Castle of Otranto, and then the premiere of this film, that's a 200-year period. So that's sort of arbitrary. I thought it was a fun coincidence. But I wanted to point that out because sort of for our purposes, or for my purposes as the person teaching the classes on the Gothic and giving this lecture this evening, I like this sort of 200-year span, right, of the publication of this first Gothic novel up to sort of the Romantic revival, if you will, of the 1960s, and looking at how in this 200-year period, the Gothic, the dark Romantic as we know it, not only gels, but becomes a very specific genre with all kinds of tropes, right, which also impact other genres as well. But the Gothic, in all of the meanings of that word, becomes a really sort of embedded set of forms. So the flickering lights within sort of the Gothic tradition is the first thing that we're going to be talking about this evening. The second form of light or light phenomenon that we're going to be talking about is electricity, but electricity in its sort of occult reality. So I wanted to read this for you. This comes from a book of essays called The Modern Stephen King Canon Beyond Horror. And there's a lot of discussion of how Stephen King certainly fits into the whole tradition of the Gothic. But this is interesting because this actually is a bit of a deep dive into this whole idea of electricity in the Gothic and the Romantic historically, and its sort of relationship over time to this idea of sort of occultism. Imagery of lightning and electricity tend to act as carriers of meanings and metaphors, far surpassing mere pathetic fallacy. Romantic poets and thinkers, for instance, often take it as a metaphor for inspiration, creative genius, or intense emotional or physical experience. Walt Whitman's I Sing the Body Electric may come to mind as an example of the latter, while Ralph Waldo Emerson's dream power in The Poet describes inspiration as a power transcending all limit and privacy, and by virtue of which a man is the conductor of the whole river of electricity. In the Gothic tradition, this metaphorical connection between the electric and inspiration often becomes the link between electricity and transgression, think Frankenstein, which is a key action of the Gothic plot. In the early days of its discovery, a variety of different theories about the workings and meaning of electricity prevailed, which inspired people to reimagine other relationships, particularly those of the material world, as well as those of the spiritual. Further, the German concept of Naturphilosophie framed electricity as an animating agent of organic life and ultimately the very soul of the universe. Okay, so I'm going to stop here because what I want to say is that, I'm trained I'm a cultural historian, but specifically I'm a cultural historian of science, mostly from the early modern period up to the early 20th century. So for me, what's so interesting when I'm teaching something like the history of the Gothic is to understand not just how material culture and lived culture, right, but also the history of people's understanding of science and of the natural world and of the body, how the theories of the time provide metaphors for artists, for writers, for dramatists, and also for the contemporary folklore, right? How how all of this sort of plays into people's understanding of what, in this case, electricity is. So the connection to inspiration, of course, which goes way back, but there are real scientific, attempts to connect this to many, many different things. That's something we'll talk about in the lecture this evening, but it's something that we will go into great depth around in the course, particularly when we're talking about, things like Frankenstein, and just the way all of these theories play into so much of this sort of uncanny literature from the Gothic into the Dark Romantic. Okay, so case in point, Frankenstein. But remember that Victor Frankenstein and Mary Shelley is creating this very sort of robust character who is highly educated in the science of his time. Victor has studied the work of Galvani, right, or Aldini. So an image for you here from Giovanni Aldini's, excuse me just a second, one of his texts, Theoretical and Experiments on Galvanism, right? We'll talk about Giovanni Galvani more in the class. But the way that electrical currents are utilized on corpses to activate muscles, right? So the whole development of the idea of the bioelectrical systems of the body is something that is being worked out in the 18th and the 19th century, and that feeds very much into a lot of these pseudoscientific theories. We'll talk about Mesmer in a second. But visually, all of these sort of early scientific apparatuses are finding their ways into sort of the visual culture of early science fiction, of the sort of fantastic Gothic literature that has to do with the resuscitation of the dead, or, if we're thinking about things like mesmerism and Svengali, controlling people, right, through some kind of bioelectricity. So the image, of course, on the right here is from James Whale's Frankenstein from 1931. And just think about how throughout all of the versions of Frankenstein that you've seen, the electrochemical apparatuses, very often connecting to lightning and such, are a huge part of the set design, right? Okay, So the flickering lights in the Gothic, the occult electricity, and then the third thing that we're going to be looking at is this idea of the luminous abyss, something grand and overwhelming in nature, in the sky, in the far north, that represents a kind of luminosity from the world of beyond. So there is a way to explain this if we're thinking about the way that Gothic literature and then Romantic art in particular are placing the human subject within the natural world. And it is also rather scenographic, right? But the individual becomes very small in front of the grand panoply of nature and the play of light, not just from the sun, but from reflection and all of these other kinds of sort of natural or supernatural luminescences becomes part of this sort of high drama, right? So I wanted to read to you this really interesting description out of the Mysteries of Udolpho, which after the Castle of Otranto is considered one of the great, great Gothic novels by Anne Radcliffe. And she's a very, very interesting character. And we'll talk a lot about her actually in the class. But listen to this passage. This is quite fascinating. This is a description of what the heroine is seeing as she travels across the Alps. Emily often, as she traveled among the clouds, very high up, watched in silent awe their billowy surges rolling below. Sometimes wholly closing upon the scene, they appeared like a world of chaos, and at others, spreading thinly, they opened and admitted partial catches of the landscape. The torrent, whose astounding roar had never failed, tumbling down the rocky chasm, huge cliffs white with snow, or the dark summits of the pine forests that stretched midway down the mountains. But who may describe her rapture when, having passed through a sea of vapor, she caught a first view of Italy, when from the ridge of one of those tremendous precipices that hang upon Mount Cenis and guard the entrance of that enchanting country, she looked down through the lower clouds, and as they floated away, saw the grassy vales of Piedmont at her feet, and beyond the plains of Lombardy extending to the farthest distance, at which appeared on the faint horizon the doubtful towers of Turin. The solitary grandeur of the objects that immediately surrounded her, the mountain region towering above, the deep precipices that fell beneath, the waving blackness of the forests of pine and oak, which skirted their feet or hung within their recesses, the headlong torrents that, dashing among their cliffs, sometimes appeared like a cloud of mist, at others like a sheet of ice. These were features which received a higher character of sublimity from the reposing beauty of the Italian landscape below, stretching to the wide horizon where the same melting blue tint seemed to unite earth and sky. So Radcliffe is well known for these vast chunks of exposition where she's describing in great detail, in the most incredible, luscious language, the layers of the view, right? So you get this sense, and we're going to definitely see how this is literally pictured in the painting of the time. The idea that nature is not only rich and vibrant, but that is just filled with these unending vistas, where very often vapor, fog, light, flashes, and shadows, all of these things become a kind of an overwhelming and grand theater. So that having been said, I think what's really interesting is this idea of the luminous abyss. You actually find that phrase in a number of different texts. So the two that I've chosen, one is out of a theological text, which interestingly is trying to tie together psychology, physiology, and theology. And then the other one is from an early science fiction story called The Diamond Lens. So just bear with me as I read these to you, because it's really setting the stage for so many of the things we're going to be exploring in the Gothic cosmos. But also, I think it's going to help unfold for us not just this idea of the luminous abyss, which we're going to look at a lot of paintings that reference this concept at the end of the talk, but also I think it's going to open up for us a kind of a sort of a psychological reality, right? Which will also explain to us something I think about why flickering lights, luminescence in the dark, and electricity also are a part of this Gothic romantic connection, right, to luminous phenomenon. Okay, so this is the Reverend A. Clissold writing this essay, and he is making reference to another writer, to Peter Charon, a celebrated writer in the Church of Rome. Okay, he speaks of God as follows. This is a quote within this essay. The properest course which it is possible for a man to take who desires to think and conceive of the deity is that the soul, after a universal abstraction from all things, raising itself above all, as in a vacuum, indeterminate and unbounded, with a profound and chaste silence, an astonishment full of awe and admiration, full of fearful humility, should imagine a luminous abyss without bottom, without shore, without banks, without height, without depth, without laying hold of or attaching itself to anything that comes into the imagination, except to lose itself, to be drowned, and resign up itself to be absorbed by this infinity. The following old sentences of the saints come very near to this. The true knowledge of God is a perfect ignorance of him. To approach God is to know an inaccessible light and to be absorbed by it. It is knowing him in some measure to perceive that as he is above all, he cannot be known. Now, this is interesting because this is a return to this idea that comes out of late medieval scholasticism. It's called nominalism. This idea of the via negativa, the idea that in order to really know the divinity, you have to go beyond all naming, all images, right? It's a very, very mystical idea. It also is very Buddhist, right? And also sort of Hindu, this idea of when you go beyond all forms, you come to the luminous abyss, right? You come to the source of all light, which itself is not a light. So it's very, very interesting how in the Gothic and the Romantic period, this idea of the sublime, the deity takes on this sort of much more mystical via negativa form, right? And that can become, in certain cases, quite heterodox and sometimes even heretical, right? So this, written just a few years later, is a passage from The Diamond Lens, a long short story novella by Fitz James O'Brien, who's a wonderful early Victorian science fiction writer. And so we're kind of going in a different direction here, right? The luminous abyss is the description of the deity, right, in what I just read to you. And in this, it's the world seen through the microscope or the diamond lens. At last, the eventful moment came. The lens was completed. I stood trembling on the threshold of new worlds. I had the realization of Alexander's famous wish before me. The lens lay on the table, ready to be placed upon its platform. My hand fairly shook as I enveloped a drop of water with a thin coating of oil of turpentine, preparatory to its examination, a process necessary in order to prevent the rapid evaporation of the water. I now placed the drop on a thin slip of glass under the lens, and throwing upon it by the combined aid of a prism and a mirror, a powerful stream of light, I approached my eye to the minute hole drilled through the axis of the lens. For an instant, I saw nothing save what seemed to be an illuminated chaos, a vast, luminous abyss. A pure white light, cloudless and serene, and seemingly limitless as space itself, was my first impression. Gently and with the greatest care, I depressed the lens a few hair's breadths. The wondrous illumination still continued, but as the lens approached the object, a scene of indescribable beauty was unfolded to my view. Now, one of the things that I want to point out is this mystical kind of theology, thinking about God as a luminous abyss, that which moves beyond all things and cannot be truly imaged. This idea also of going down into the microscopic world and seeing a kind of new vastness which opens up a whole new reality. That luminosity from something that is not the sun is pictured forth in a lot of Gothic, dark romantic, and then in a lot of other weird stories, right? So, case in point, we're going to talk a lot about John Martin in the class and more about him later in the lecture. Martin is a really, really interesting painter. I'll tell you more about him in a minute. But this is an incredible image of him. He did a lot of paintings based on John Milton. A scene in Pandemonium, which is Satan's capital in Paradise Lost. Pandemonium, the realm of all devils or all demons, and he has pictured it as being in this volcanic underworld, right? So the luminous abyss here is literally hell itself, in which the ground is molten. And Martin's paintings of this are just absolutely incredible. But what's interesting is less than a century later, somebody like H.P. Lovecraft is creating his Cthulhu cosmos, and in that you're getting all kinds of otherworldly entities and mysteries and horrors, which are also luminous in some way. So I wanted to put this up for you. This is an illustration by J.M. de Arago from the 1927 publication of Lovecraft's The Color Out of Space. And you can see the extraterrestrial thing has landed in the well, and it's, creating also this dark, creepy luminosity. So in the class, I'm going to be doing, mostly in the second half of the class, in the Gothic Cosmos Part II, talking about the very strong connection and the real, very real chain, right, genealogy from Gothic literature and dark romanticism all the way into early science fiction. So anyway, the luminous abyss is a part of all of this. Okay, so what I want to do, I want to kind of give an introduction to this idea of the Gothic, because again, this lecture is kind of a pitch for this two-part class. And so I want to talk about this idea of the Gothic historically, because if we're thinking of the meaning of the Gothic, where this idea really comes from is in the 18th century, particularly in England, but also in Germany and some other parts of Europe. There is this real pushback against a lot of the rationalism of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. And part of the pushback is a cultural pushback. And it's an attempt to reclaim in some way these things from the Middle Ages, right, which stand in contrast to the classical tradition. So if we think about the Goths, those are the, indigenous European tribes in Gaul and in, the German part of the world, and in, the Visigoths end up ruling the Iberian Peninsula. But these are the people who sack Rome and then, merge with the Romans. And from the point of view of thinking about the fall of Rome and the loss of classical culture, that which is Gothic is seen to be barbaric. But in the 18th century, there's a real attempt to reclaim the Middle Ages, right? And so Gothic architecture, which hadn't been called Gothic up until this point, is seen to be something that is special to the non-Roman parts of Europe, to the older parts of Europe. Gothic is seen to be, yes, barbarous, but in certain ways it's also more organic. And the wildness of it, the organicism of it, is seen to be something that is healthy, something that is important, and something that needs to be reclaimed. And out of this reclamation of the Gothic, the Romantic grows. This is a very complex story, and that's why, I'm so excited about teaching this class, because there's so many important things to consider and to understand, particularly if we're thinking about how the term Gothic is used in the 18th and the 19th century as a way to sort of reclaim the Dark Ages, which after all weren't that dark in many ways. So the medieval architecture that has been so reviled, which is later called the Gothic, high Gothic architecture is often referred to as the Rayonnette style because it's so refined, it's so open, and light, of course, is central to all of this, because after we move through what is known as the Romanesque period, where civic and liturgical architecture in Europe is so heavy, even though a lot of it is based also on Roman forms, The Gothic is the taking of these things and it is adding space. And I'm sure many of you know this. This is sort of art history, Western art history 101. But the quality of luminescence is also something that is central to the Gothic. So, although in tonight's lecture I'm talking about sort of the spooky lights of the Gothic as we know it, within this is also the seed of the positive elements of the medieval Gothic, in which the mysticism of light plays a redemptive and an uplifting and an inspiring role, right? And that's also very much a part of the Romantic tradition, the Neo-Gothic revival in the Victorian period. So I want to talk a little bit, and this is not about the Gothic of the 18th century, this is about the actual Gothic, so the actual sort of medieval mysticism of light, because this is something that one can see actually carried through, particularly in the 19th century, with the reclamation and the restoration of so much of this. So in the High Middle Ages, if we're thinking about the Sainte-Chapelle, this begins, of course, with the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis. We'll talk about Abbot Suger in a minute. Of course, Chartres Cathedral, Notre Dame in Paris. There is this explosion of the use of stained glass and also of the delicacy of the tracery to bring as much light in as possible. But this is tied to a very specific belief that light itself can be a mechanism for moving human beings closer to God. So how does that work? This is a quote from Abbot Suger, who's sort of considered the father of the Gothic in art history. And Abbot Suger, of course, is the one who's responsible for so much of this early Gothic architecture, right? And also a lot of the creation of precious objects and the collecting of treasure, which then is also part of a program, right? Gems reflect light, to utilize the quality of things that dazzle to bring the worshiper into closer proximity with the divine. Okay, a quote from Abbot Suger. Bright is the noble work, but being nobly bright, the work should brighten the minds so that they may travel through the true lights to the true light, where Christ is the true door. So Suger believed, and this actually comes out of some very early mystical Christian literature, Dionysius the Areopagite and his angelology, this idea of how sort of light travels down from the luminous abyss of God, if you will, into the hearts of people. And it's the project of somebody like Abbot Suger to create spaces where the physical dazzlement and the physical light causes illumination, the experience of the soul rising up through the lights of the splendor in the church to the higher radiance, which is the radiance of God. And there's, actually words for these, the lux, the lumen, and the illuminatio. So I used to teach a class on the history of Paris, and we spent a whole week on all of this stuff because it's central to the program of Gothic architecture, Gothic music. Like when people first start writing about polyphony, there is some worry that it's almost like the song of sirens, and that people will be so overwhelmed and seduced by it that will actually move them away from God into the realm of pure ecstasy and pleasure. But that's not Suger's belief. Suger's belief is that that type of ecstasy, which is brought about in these holy spaces, actually moves us closer to the divine. And what we'll find is that this has a kind of a dark side within the Gothic tradition, where the sublime actually moves us into a place of overwhelm and horror, right? But also, if you think about the tradition of Romanticism, there is a real celebration of this very idea, right? As people are moving around in these spaces. So before I get a little more deeply into these three kinds of light, specifically in the Gothic and in the Dark Romantic, I want to stay with this idea of what the Goths mean in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century as there is a European reclamation of all things Gothic. So the Goths and the Gothic in Romantic thought signify a lot of different things. They signify this idea of barbarian origin. The Goths represent the violent end of classical Rome and the birth of post-Roman Europe. They mark historical rupture, necessary destruction, but they're also associated, with the sort of darkness and excess. But very often it's the darkness and the excess of Rome. And so there's also this romantic idea, which actually ends up finding its way sort of into eugenics too, that nature, it's also this sort of horrible idea of the cleansing power of war, that when civilizations fall, when bodies fall apart, when things are destroyed, there's a sort of an entelechy at work, right? There's some kind of a power being used to cleanse the world. And that very much comes into a lot of particularly late Romantic and sort of decadent thinking about the cycles of history, right? So the Goths play an important part in some of that. I'm getting a little off topic here, but this is in the class, we'll explore this. So the Goths are also the abject of civilization. So the Gothic during the Enlightenment period means a rejection of reason, means superstition, cruelty, irrationality, feudalism, terror. But remember, by the time we start to get to Walpole and then the Romantics, there's a rethinking of all of this. There is this idea we see in the Romantic Revival, we see this in Gothic literature. No, wait a minute, these people are our ancestors. And so, yes, maybe they were barbarians, but we come from them. And we need to actually see what is positive about them that is different from the classical rationalism that everybody is always saying is the best. Again, I pointed this out. This is very interesting if you think about Gothic art and architecture as being much more organic. Think about all of the ways that the tracery of the High Gothic, from the borders of the illuminated manuscripts to the stained glass windows, to the way that there's so much play with sort of vine motifs, organic motifs, things like that, right? All over Europe in the cathedrals, how much more organic, plant-like. Think about how the figures, carved in a lot of the Romanesque, those, and then later in the Gothic, those very tall, elongated figures that look almost like trees. And then, of course, the Green Man. There's a real celebration of nature. And in the Gothic and in the Romantic period, and then certainly in the Victorian period, all the way up into Art Nouveau, there's a belief that that represents something more real and important than sort of the hard rationalism, right? So that is how the idea of the Gothic also becomes redemptive and holistic, or represents the idea of the redemptive and the holistic, returning us to nature. In Gothic literature, the Gothic survives as ruin, monster, curse, or ancestral crime, right? So that's also an important thing. The dark side of the Gothic. The dark side of the Gothic is also kind of a leftover for this idea of the barbarism of the Goths. But as I've said, there's also this idea that in a way, in order to restore balance, the Enlightenment, and then the French Revolution are kind of the rationalism taken to their extreme. A big part of what we're going to be talking about in the class, and that's why part of the subtitle of the first half of the class is called Revolutions of the Unreal. Remember that the Gothic revival, this Gothic and Romantic period, is the moment when, Europe there's so many revolutions happening, right? So there is this idea that there is a cleansing that needs to occur. But because so much of this comes out of Enlightenment thinking, there's also a pushback. There's a counter-enlightenment, right? There's a kind of a dark enlightenment. We've been hearing a lot about that. But here, there's a real historical reason for it, right? It's not kind of a pastiche thing. It's actually a real lived counter-movement against the excesses of rationalism. And the Gothic revival is very much a part of that. So some images for you from the high Romantic period and then the late Romantic period of the Goths themselves. I love this. Joseph Noel Silvestre's The Sack of Rome. You've got these two very hunky Goths, pulling down a statue of one of the emperors. Um, Images of the sack of Rome and the sort of attempt to give um, a visual to give a visual vocabulary to the Goths is very much an important part of the Gothic revival of the Romantic period, right? And that, as we'll see eventually, that plays into a lot of nationalism as well. That's a big part of this also as well, right? There's this um, nascent idea, which certainly is going to feed into fascism in the 20th century, but this idea that there's something about the blood and the soil, the lineage of the ancestors that is vital and important, and that has been forgotten, right? And that needs to be remembered and celebrated. Okay, so Horace Walpole, as I've said, is very often considered sort of the father of the Gothic. He writes the first great Gothic novel, The Castle of Otranto. But it's not just The Castle of Otranto. Horace Walpole, who also was a child of great privilege and who was gay, he was an antiquarian, quite really an amazing figure. He works from 1749 to 1776 on his own passion project, his home, Strawberry Hill House, very often known as Strawberry Hill, which is an attempt to create, in the Gothic, neo-Gothic mode, a space that is a hearkening back to all of the good things in the medieval and the high medieval. So, fan vaults and having things like bookcases and marble fireplaces carved in the style of the motifs of the Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages. And so, a lot of the Gothic imagery, the Gothic castles of the later 19th century, think of Neuschwanstein and things like that. It all begins almost 100 years earlier with this passion project of Horace Walpole. So he casts a big shadow, and he's going to be a big part of our story in the class. It's been recently restored, I think in the last 8 to 10 years. Looks like a wonderful place to visit. I can't wait. And then, of course, not just the architectural space he's creating, but the Castle of Otranto, which is considered the first great Gothic novel. All of the tropes, right? The hauntings, the curse of the past, mistaken identity, forced marriages, possible incest, specters in the night, skeletons with chains, all these things, right, are elements and ingredients in the Castle of Otranto. When Walpole first wrote this, it was written in this almost like metafictional way, where it was posited that, it was a legend of the era of the Crusades that had been recovered and was, translated out of another language. And eventually people caught on, right? But in the second edition, he actually subtitles it A Gothic Story. So Castle of Otranto is really, really important because all of these elements that we're talking about when it comes to sort of the lighting of the Gothic, they're all there. So I want to talk really quickly about sort of the phenomenology. I want to step back a little bit and talk about sort of the lived experience of people in this period, right, in the 18th and in the 19th century before industrialization, and how Gothic literature and dark romanticism really play into the very real lived experience of night, right? So a book I would highly recommend is A. Roger E. Kirk's incredible, very rich text, just packed with primary sources. Absolutely wonderful. At Day's Close, Night in Time's Past, where he really looks at just all of the experiences that people both in the countryside and in the city had around night, the dangers of night, what their relationship to artificial lights was, to candles, to torches, to the dangers of getting drunk after dark and walking home and falling in a ditch and breaking your leg, or even this whole idea of the first and second sleep, because as many of you I'm sure know, before industrialization and clock time and going to work in factories, people typically slept in 2 shifts because their bodies and their relationship to sleep, very much followed the course of the day and the night. And so there's this period between first and second sleep in the middle of the night. People would wake up, make love, talk to the neighbor, go check on the animals, do some chores, do some writing, or just sit in bed and talk. And so the world of dreams, the world of the dead, the lived experience of night, sleep, darkness, light in darkness, very, very different phenomenological, physical, psychological, spiritual experience than people have had for the last 100 to 200 years. So Ekirk really gets into that. And when you read a book like this, I feel that you can really come to understand a lot of the artwork and the literature of the Gothic period and the early Romantic period much better, because you start to understand the lived experience in a different way. Illustrative of this is a painting that I love from the Art Institute of Chicago from 1906 called Lights of Other Days. Isn't that fabulous? So again, the theme of this lecture, these three sort of lighting phenomenon or ways that light appears within Gothic texts and Gothic paintings. The flickering light, the torch in the gloom. An image for you from the 1600s of a woman holding one of these lights up. This is the tradition of chiaroscuro. Of course, comes into great use in the High Renaissance and the Baroque period. And then in the Dutch Golden Age and then in the Romantic period, it continues, particularly with these solitary figures. So the painter is showing not only their mastery as painters of being able to create light sources in the way light moves with shadow, but also it's trompe l'oeil, right? Figures are moving almost out of the picture in almost a proto-cinematic way. They're coming towards you with candlelight. An image for you by Henri Fuseli, the great Blake contemporary who painted so many of these incredible, dynamic, dark, erotic images out of Shakespeare, out of Milton. This is Lady Macbeth sleepwalking. Sleepwalking is a very important thing in the story of Gothic literature and Romantic art. Here she's holding a torch up. Likewise, almost 100 years later, the great Gustave Doré, illustrating this very bizarre text, the Legend of Croque-Mitaine, which is an old French term, I believe, for the boogeyman. The Legend of Croque-Mitaine is a mid-19th century pastiche, much like the Castle of Otranto, writing about the legends of Charlemagne and the knights. There's a very interesting scene in this, and Doré has illustrated it, of these bizarre wonders that one of the knights is encountering. And these are the corpse candles, so these spectral figures holding up these torches, very much looking like sort of giant versions of a lot of these very creepy figures you would see in these religious processions, right? These shrouded or hooded figures holding these very, very strange candles. But that image, candlelight, torchlight, eerie figures, these are things that we all know, right? From Gothic literature, from films, and from, certainly the whole industry of modern horror. But I also want to point out that, one of the other important motifs within the Gothic and the Romantic is moonlight. And again, in keeping with this idea of the luminous abyss, the light of the moon is also functioning in many ways as this sort of mysterious power projecting something out. So, of course, Caspar David Friedrich, Two Men Contemplating the Moon, and then his contemporary Carl Gustav Caros, showing Cemetery in the Moonlight. Now, if you just saw Robert Eggers' new version of Nosferatu, there are many, many scenes in that film which are taken directly from the paintings of Caspar David Friedrich. The Wanderer Above Clouds is literally remade in that film. And then also the images of the women walking along the coastline with all of the graves made out of these iron staves. That comes directly, well, I mean, of course, it comes out of, Murnau's film, but Murnau himself was also drawing on the Romantic art history of his culture. And so this eerie, luminous moonlight is such an important thing, both in the literature and also in the art of the genres that we're talking about here. I wanted to mention that moonlight and the moon's impact, particularly on women, has a long history sort of in Western esotericism and also in medicine. So to be a lunatic is to be under the influence of the moon. So an image for you from a 17th century engraving entitled The Influence of the Moon on Women's Minds. And then a later painting, La Somnambula. La Somnambula, the sleepwalker, particularly the female sleepwalker, becomes a central figure in the Gothic and in the Romantic period. Poems, plays, operas, this idea of the woman under the influence of the moon, or sometimes under a sinister magician, Count Cagliostro. Again, I've mentioned Svengali and Trilby. It's a little bit later. That's a Victorian text. But this idea of the beautiful, fragile woman in trance, very often walking across a tightrope or a beam or on the parapet of a house or the roof of a house. There's even an opera called La Somnambula, which I think is Bellini. This idea of the connection of moonlight and the disturbed or the dreaming mind is central to so much of this. It's not just the glow of candles and torches and the moon. Supernatural figures that play a part in the Gothic novel, in all of the romantic tropologies of the 19th century, right? Ghosts, angels, otherworldly messengers, fairies. All of these are pictured as being glowing bodies. So case in point, a beautiful painting by Horace Vernet, La Ballade de Lenore, illustrating what I think is a German poem about this phantom knight that sweeps this woman off to the underworld or God knows where. And this wonderful painting, she's lifting up the lid of the visor and it's a glowing skull. Likewise, here, Arthur Hughes' painting of Sir Galahad and the angelic messengers. But the glow of these bodies is something that's central both in the descriptions that you'll find of ghosts, apparitions, and the like, and also in the artwork of the period, over and over again. Now, something I want to point out, I just mentioned E. Kirk's text. Again, as a historian and as a teacher, I love to point these things out to my students because anytime you're studying any period of time, it's also important to be thinking about what are the entertainments, what are the physical customs or the objects that people are coming into contact with on a daily basis or on special occasions that can also help them to imagine things, right? So the magic lantern, the early slide projector, is an invention that goes back to the Renaissance. But by the time you start to get to the late 17th and then in the 18th and certainly into the 19th century, you actually have magic lantern peddlers. So guys that are going from village to village and city to city that are actually setting up these little shows to show to people. And of course, this is, the elite are, of course, also have these things. And there's, people like Athanasius Kircher and all these other, sort of very, very elite scientific philosophers have these type of apparati in their laboratories. But the common folk are also coming into contact with them more and more. And if we think about the Victorian period, the high romantic period, things like the phantasmagoria that comes out of the French Revolutionary period, this use of projection technology to create apparitions, to create special effects, is having a big impact more and more on everyday people. So within the Gothic Romantic period, when all of these sort of luminous things are being written about, the luminosity and the spookiness, right, in the stories, there's a very real sort of material culture experiential connection. And a lot of that also has to do with the culture of the magic lantern. And a lot's been written about that, the connection to the magic lantern, to the experience of wonder, and how the popularizing of this influences metaphors and the art and the literature of the time. So now I want to talk about electricity, because electricity as a phenomenon is something that is being studied intensely in the time of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. But alongside of that, any type of a phenomenon that is being written about, talked about, and remember, we're getting into the era of mass literacy when we get into the 18th, into the early 19th century, right? So everybody is coming to understand that electricity is something. And even though, they might not understand it in the way that we understand it now, it's in the zeitgeist. So it's also providing a very powerful metaphor for a lot of other things, as science always does. People who are not in the sciences are always borrowing from the sciences in a metaphorical way to make their own point, and very often doing that in a way that is, if not disingenuous, certainly inaccurate, and I think often disingenuous. Okay, this is a great text I want to recommend to you, Spirituality and the Occult, from the Renaissance to the Modern Age. Excellent book. But the part that I've pulled out has to do with electricity in this period of time. Enlightenment science, with its mysterious new forces of gravity and electricity, remember, Newton's Principia has come out, Lavoisier has discovered electricity, right? All these, Benjamin Franklin. This is providing a fertile ground in which the seeds of occultism could grow. On the other hand, the occultists themselves were at the forefront of investigating such occult fluids as electricity and illuminism and electrical science, stimulated each other throughout the Enlightenment. The word electricity itself was introduced into English in 1650 by the alchemist Jean-Baptiste van Helmont. A century later, the theosopher, so this is before theosophy with a capital T, but that's a mystical Christian, Prokop Davish's experiments with electricity enabled him to anticipate Ben Franklin's invention of the lightning rod. By this time, a number of electrical theologians were incorporating electricity into their theosophical systems. Okay, so this is something else that I want to point out. And this is why something like Frankenstein can occupy this really, from our point of view, interesting space of being scientific or proto-scientific in a very modern way, because there are very real experiments going on cadavers and electrical currents. But also, people don't really understand everything that we understand now, obviously. So electricity is also a stand-in for the power of God, the power of creation, for the forces coming out of the luminous abyss, right? And so it's in this very, very interesting kind of, from our point of view, liminal place, electricity is. Hence, I'm calling it occult, because it is representative, again, of these hidden and misunderstood forces, which alchemists, quacks, healers, all these different people are thinking with electricity as a metaphor to describe what they themselves are trying to work out, and usually not in a scientific way, in the way that we now understand the scientific method. Okay, so what I want to do throughout the rest of this lecture is kind of leave the text behind and really look at a lot of the visual work that is pulling on everything that I've just introduced. And that I think is going to give you also a flavor for a lot of what we're going to be doing in the full class, because I'm a working artist, and I also have a very deep background in art history, visual culture, material culture studies. I'm very interested in the stuff, and how, if we can understand the milieu in which the stuff was created, the stuff also can unfold for us a deeper understanding of a lot of what we're trying to get at here in the past, right? So 2 images for you here around lightning, but lightning is representative of this Gothic, dark romantic sort of occult sensibility. Eugène Delacroix's Horse Frightened by Lightning. Of course, Delacroix, the great revolutionary romantic, is interested in the Sturm und Drang of bodies, both animal bodies and human bodies, massacres in history, women being carried off by centaurs, and then also, as in this case, a beautiful white horse kind of going nuts during a lightning storm, right? And this is something else that we need to remember. And you see this in Walpole, you see it all the way up to the decadence. Well, and actually you see it still in contemporary filmmaking, how the forces of nature are used as shorthand or stand-ins or as a coinciding phenomenon with dramatic emotional experience, right? And that's something that comes out of this period. This is incredible. This is a painting done a couple of decades later by Maxim Vorobiev. Listen to the title. I love this. Oak fractured by lightning, allegory on the artist's wife's death. Look how modern this painting looks. So this explosion, this lightning splitting this tree, is an allegorical representation for the striking down of the painter's wife. So this idea of how grief, sudden death, right, that force of experience, physical lived experience, is then pictured in this event, this natural event of a tree being split by lightning. Right? Now, a little bit more mythical. This is two American painters. This is Prairie on Fire by Charles Dease, and this is completed in 1847. And you can see, of course, the very typical sort of, pale white heroine being carried off. She's fainted, of course, but being carried off on the white horse as there's a bolt of lightning in the upper, right-hand corner, and fire is spreading across the plain here, across the prairie. And then likewise, this is by the American artist William Holbrook Beard. I think this is in the Smithsonian. I love this. This is painted in the late 19th century. Lightning struck a flock of witches. So drawing on that tradition of the witches' Sabbath, but actually incorporating this idea of, the witches actually not quite being in control of the lightning, or maybe they're being struck down, by a puritanical god, who knows. But it's all the same thing energetically and tropologically, right? I just think these are quite stunning and theatrical. A little bit earlier, a couple of examples of lightning used in a mythological or also a biblical way. This is a wild engraving by William Blake. I think it's based on actually an earlier illustration by Fuseli. Somehow Blake and Fuseli are connected in this engraving. I can't quite remember how. At any rate, it's called Tornado Zeus Battling Typhon. And this comes from Erasmus Darwin's book, The Botanic Garden. So this is some kind of a classical allegorical use of the old mythical idea of Zeus or Jupiter vanquishing Typhon, the god of chaos, the titan of chaos, sea demon. And it's just incredible how he's sort of holding the lightning bolts. But that's also, of course, a very, very ancient trope, right? Zeus or Jupiter holding the bolts of lightning. But you'll see that, again, I'm trying to make a point here that in the Romantic and the Gothic period, lightning appears over and over again just as a really strong element in so many different ways. Here's Moses breaking the tablets of the law from Gustave Doré's illustration for the Bible in the middle of the 19th century. Again, the bolt of lightning as a stand-in for the wrath of God. And of course, everybody from, Cecil B. DeMille to Willis O'Brien, the special effects master and the designer of King Kong, draw on very consciously the illustrations of Gustave Doré. And actually, this is a little off topic, but in thinking about the influence of Doré, if you know Belle et la Bête by Jean Cocteau, there are images in Belle et la Bête which are taken right out of Doré's illustrations for the fairy tales of Charles Perrault. So again, a point that I want to make, and I'll be making it much more in the class if you come take the class with me, is the connection that we can follow from the Gothic and the Romantic all the way into cinema, right? There's a direct line, a direct chain of inheritance of forms. John Martin's The Destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, absolutely spectacular. We'll talk more about John Martin in a minute. But here you get the bolt of lightning and you also have the luminous abyss, right? So Martin is really, really sort of, in a sense, one of these other precursors to cinema. Talk more about that in a second. And then this is a little bit later. This is Lightning by the Lithuanian artist Cyr Leonis, one of my favorite late Romantic, early 20th century symbolist painters. But just look at how these bolts of lightning almost look like figures advancing from the horizon, across this lake. Just eerie and wonderful. The symbolists and the late romantics, in fact, so much of this goes into very early modernism. You can see a direct flow from the Gothic to the Romantic to the symbolist and the Decadent, all the way up into the to early modernism. And so much of this has to do with an attempt to concretize, using the elements of nature, that which is ineffable. So, as I've said, lightning in its occult form also coalesces around some really important figures, mostly Benjamin Franklin, and then also Franz Mesmer, who it comes up with the idea of animal magnetism. But it's interesting because in Benjamin Franklin's own lifetime, he's kind of mythologized, right? And people are writing poems about him sort of as this master and tamer of lightning. But it's interesting how the romantics sort of pick that up and then image him as almost kind of a Merlin character, like Zeus, the one who holds the lightning bolt, right? So beautiful image by Benjamin West, who actually knew Franklin. Um, and then this is from the rotunda of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. This is from Constantino Brumidi's really over the top apotheosis of George Washington. But you can see the goddess, I think it's Minerva, and then you can see the rainbow coming down, and there's Franklin there too. So this idea of turning Franklin into a demigod, or as kind of a magus, right? That's something that you see over and over again in the 19th and the early 20th century in the way that he's visually represented. And the lightning is always there, or very often is. So just like Franklin, Franz Mesmer is a German doctor, but he's a bit of a charlatan too, right? Or, it's possible that he also really believed in what he was doing. But Mesmer became so powerful and important in the last years of the Ancien Regime, that actually there was a whole investigation, and Franklin was a part of this too, to see whether Franz Mesmer and his idea of animal magnetism really held water. And Mesmer was using all of these techniques, which we would now call hypnosis, but he also had a lot of different sort of weird apparati that he was using because he believed that electricity and sort of the bioelectricity of the body could be used for healing people in many, many different ways. So at any rate, when he is pictured in the popular press or in his own texts, or then later on as the idea travels and is used by other people, you will very often see him. It's not bolts of lightning, but you will see energy rays coming out of his fingers, coming out of his eyes. So again, throughout the Gothic and the Romantic period, this idea of lightning or of light or of rays of light, very often emanating from a person who has animal magnetism, is a very important trope. This comes up so much even like in early horror films, if you just think about the eyes. I mean, think about the 1931 version of Dracula, where they actually have those two pin lights on Bela Lugosi's eyes when he's hypnotizing one of the women. That comes out of this. And it actually goes back a little bit further. This is totally kind of off topic, but I want to pop it in here as a historian of science. There are these old ideas that come out of the Renaissance and much earlier out of the Islamic world and out of the Greek world and the classical world. It's called the emission theory of light. There's this idea that rays of light actually emanate out of human eyeballs. So some of this idea about the power of the gaze, the rays of desire, there's actually an old tradition of this. And sometimes that's actually also connected to lightning. Okay, Luigi Galvani, Giovanni Aldini, these Italian scientists of the 18th and very early 19th century are doing very real experiments using battery-operated currents on cadavers, frog legs, cattle heads, human cadavers. And these experiments with bioelectricity and how the nervous system and the muscular system relate to electrical currents becomes a very important set of investigations into the workings of the body and also the idea of life. And of course, that's central to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And if you think about any Frankenstein movie, as I've said, that you see, whether it's the wonderful Hammer films or last year's Del Toro version of Frankenstein, um, the technology of electricity is always central to the scenes in the laboratory and the animating of the monster, right? So the occult, life-giving nature of electricity, as it is understood in the Romantic period, is central to the visualization of all of the Frankenstein films. Okay, so let's end this lecture by talking about our last grouping of Gothic romantic luminous phenomenon, and that's this idea of the luminous abyss. So I talked a little bit about that before. It might sound kind of obscure, but I think you're going to kind of understand what I'm getting at here when I talk about the overwhelming source of light coming from nature, from this world or from other worlds, whether we're talking about the sky, whether we're talking about underground, this idea of the vastness. And sometimes that can be supernatural. It's experiential, but the human being is overwhelmed by it, right? By this luminous void, this luminous abyss, this luminous grandeur. Okay, this is related to the idea of the sublime. So I think this is so fascinating. If you break down the word sublime, it goes back to sub and limen. So literally in Latin, it means up to the threshold, right? The experience of the sublime takes us right up to the threshold. And if we're thinking about romantic painters such as Caspar David Friedrich, you as the viewer are very often looking at a viewer who has their back to you, who is standing in front of something that is sublime. And very often this is a luminous vastness. Remember, if you think back to what I read from the Mysteries of Udolpho, the overwhelm of the vistas of the natural landscape swallow you up. There's this idea also of like the individual being completely insignificant. And I think that's central to the depths also of Gothic and Romantic horror. Because the sublime is ecstasy, but it can also tip over very quickly into terror and then horror even, right? Case in point, John Martin. We'll talk much more about John Martin in the class, but John Martin is so important for what I'm talking about here because in all of his paintings, nature and supernature, if you will, take on this vastness and the luminosity that pours forth from these different gates, right, to the outer, under, or other world is a part of the dramatic experience, the dramatic experience of the little figures, moving within the painting, but more importantly, the experience of us as the audience identifying with these tiny figures that are overwhelmed by the luminosity and also the abyss. So this is his image of the destruction of Pompeii and Herculaneum. So the explosion of the volcano, connecting with lightning and the storm clouds and almost becoming like this glowing cavern in the sky. Likewise, here's another one of his pieces, having to do with Milton, the fallen angels entering pandemonium, where the luminous abyss is the hellish underworld. Something I want to share with you really quickly is John Martin became hugely successful, popular, and wealthy because his paintings toured, and people would pay as they toured to come in and look at them. They were put up in town halls and tents and things like that. And very often they were also accompanied by music and changing colored lights. So John Martin's grand, dramatic, apocalyptic vistas are actually in many ways a part of this sort of concept that we have in media archaeology of kind of proto-cinema, right? And it's no wonder that so many cinematic, special effects designers, think of the great matte painters of old or the miniaturists when special effects were pre-CGI, they're drawing on this stuff. And in the very early cinema, many of them had probably seen some of these. Two more. Sadak in Search of the Waters of Oblivion. I mean, look at this. You've got this tiny figure of this character crawling up onto this cliff, and then there is this, as in the Mysteries of Udolpho, this thundering cataract of water, the light pouring in from above, the light seeming to come in from below. I mean, the light's pouring in from everywhere. And it's sort of creepy and strange because naturalistically, it should all be coming from the sun, but it seems to be coming from a lot of different sources, almost like a fever dream. he was a great illustrator and very famous for his mezzotints. So he illustrated the Bible, a lot of these incredible, disasters from history. But again, like Fuseli and Blake, was also very, very interested in Milton. So this is the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden, one of the mezzotints he created for Milton's Paradise Lost. And again, look at this. The light is coming in from all these different sources and it's all glowing. And you get the sense of these abysses or voids, the light pouring out of the gate, the rocky gate from the Garden of Eden where they're being driven out. And then the bolt of lightning actually coming down from the upper left-hand corner in this cavern of clouds. And then look down in the valley, how the winding river almost seems to be made of phosphorus. Now, across the pond in America, we have our own version of Martin, and that's Thomas Cole. He's very famous for this incredible allegory, The Voyage of Life. So this is manhood. And so you can see the tiny figure in the boat on this, allegorical golden little skiff here. There's a tiny little angelic figure up in the clouds. The waterfall is glowing. I love this. This is called the Titan's Goblet. And if you're able to, take some time, pull this up online and just look at the details. So there's this giant goblet, which is actually it's sort of like a Tolkien kind of image, right? It's actually a giant lake. And if you look very closely, you can see tiny ships actually sailing around in this gigantic goblet. But look at the light, right? There's a luminosity to this and a sense of just vastness. Evening in Arcadia from the 1840s, Landscape with Clouds from the 1840s, both by Thomas Cole. So again, this is nature, but it is nature in a romantic key, sort of exploded in this, outward in this really hyper dramatic, cinematic, it's before cinema, but in a way that feels, right, very, very cinematic and overwhelming. Now, what's interesting is this concept of the luminous abyss or the luminous void comes up a lot in Edgar Allan Poe in his descriptions of what these people are very often encountering or writing about, these mysterious, bizarre things. So in the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, the character ends up, I think it's in the North Pole, and there's this strange ice gate, and there's this Arthur Gordon Pym perceives to be this cloaked figure, and you don't know if it's a hallucination or if it's some kind of something out of H.P. Lovecraft, some kind of a titanic figure that lives there. What is this? But or is it an optical illusion? But it is this strange, luminous, gigantic figure in this sort of ice cathedral that the boat is coming towards. Likewise, in all of the illustrations of his descent into the maelstrom, remember I showed you that first image on the opening slide, as the person is going around and around like a bit of debris in the drain, but the maelstrom of course is vast and swallows ships and whales and sea serpents and everything like that. But the way that it is often pictured, it seems to be luminous. And so, Poe creates these things that are Gothic and romantic, where the individual is dwarfed and overwhelmed by the forces of nature. Now, he does something else. There are 3 short stories, and for the life of me, I cannot remember the third one. But I've put up 2 because they have illustrations that go with him. The colloquy, or the dialogue of Monos and Una, and then the conversation of Eros and Charmian. So in each of these cases, Poe writes a dialogue between a male and a female spirit. They're either dead people in the afterlife, or they're entities that are disembodied that are in another dimension. And what's interesting is, if you look at the artwork that's been created for these, very often they're like figures floating in a luminous abyss. So this is Harry Clark, the great Harry Clark, the wonderful illustrator and stained glass designer from Ireland, the colloquy of Monos and Una. He's created this whole sort of cavalcade of spirits, these very sort of wonderful long Art Nouveau shimmering figures for this dialogue that Poe has written. These are deeply philosophical as well. And he is writing, remember, Poe is writing in the very early 19th century. So he's also very interested in electromagnetism, the survival of the soul, mesmerism, all the things that we're talking about, and also these natural phenomena that can't be explained and how they relate to the soul and to the experience of consciousness. That's central to almost everything that Poe writes. This is Alberto Martini, wonderful early 20th century Italian illustrator. If you don't know him, treat yourself. Spend some time looking through Alberto Martini's illustrations to Poe. They are out there, brilliant. But as you can see here, in his illustration for the Conversation of Eros and Charmian, this dark shadow figure is looking up at this other figure, which is manifesting as sort of this luminous ball in the void, right? So, as I say, what's behind so much of this is the explosion of the sciences, of exploration, and also of the popularization of all of this technology. People are able to look through telescopes. People are reading about, how vast the universe is. And also, there's things like celestial atlases that are being created and printed. And, people are going to world's fairs, having experiences in planetariums. This idea of the luminous abyss, the glowing, vast, mysterious universe on earth and in heaven, is very much a part of the popular experience of the sudden explosion of understanding how big and also how old everything is. Charles Lyell, Charles Darwin are completely reshaping the human understanding of how ancient the earth is, how slow these processes are. And also, for the first time, not always accurately, dinosaurs and prehistoric animals are being reconstructed for popular consumption. So, in the Victorian era, which is the Romantic era, people are going to exhibitions and they're coming to understand, even though they're good middle class Christians very often, wait a minute. Everything that we're coming to understand now is showing us that, the ideas that we've had in our Christian faith about the shape of things, the age of things, the relationship of things in nature, and particularly our relationship to the natural world, these scales, the sizes, the extents, that it just doesn't make sense anymore. This is a real age of anxiety, and that dovetails perfectly with the anxiety of the Gothic and the dark Romantic. So to end this, I want to talk about the luminous abyss in the way that it's pictured in the dark Romantic and in the way, this also comes out of the Gothic. Caspar David Friedrich, our friend, is very interested in polar exploration, and his painting The Sea of Ice, also known as the Polar Sea. If you look very closely, you can actually see an overturned ship, is part and parcel of everything that we're talking about, right? The dark, mysterious glow of the north and the impenetrable, implacable nature of ice, right? And, Coleridge is writing about this in The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And Doré, if you don't know Doré's illustration to The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, again, treat yourself, take some time to look through these. But this idea of the human experience of the exploration of these parts of the world that are unknown and mysterious is, I would say, part of this idea of the abyss, of the void, which nevertheless very often is a source of an otherworldly light. And phenomenally, think about the northern lights. Think about things like sundogs, the illusions that are created in these spaces. And because this is part of a lot of these, not only these travel logs and the diaries of explorers that many of these artists are reading, but it becomes a part of the fiction, both the adventure fiction and then also the science fiction. How human minds, when they are placed in these vast spaces, start to go into very, very strange places, right? So this is the other thing that's also kind of central to the Gothic and the Romantic. The human imagination and the human mind in relationship to the vastness and to the strange phenomenon in nature can be put into alignment with these greater powers, but also can be destroyed by it through madness. So, likewise, thinking about here on Earth, this idea of the luminous abyss and the natural expanse that overwhelms with strange phenomenon experience, the deserts. So, think about I'm going to have a whole week actually in this first half of the Gothic Cosmos where we talk about the Gothic exotic, about how Orientalism is a big part of this story as well. As Europeans are beginning to colonize and explore and, to really exist in a lot of these spaces that they're not native to, this also plays into this sort of magical and imaginary way of thinking of otherness. But it's based on actually real physical experience as well. So just as the polar north becomes a kind of a luminous abyss, so does the desert expanse, the mirage, all of the folklore of the Berbers and the Bedouins and the experience of spirits, right? So there's also that occultism element, but also just the way that a person can disappear in the desert and never be found again, right? So all of that is very much a part of the Romantic imagination. Again, as I've said, this understanding of the vastness of the spaces on Earth and also the spaces outside of the Earth. By the time we get to the late 19th century, and we're moving away from the celebration of things like John Milton and Pandemonium, and that becomes kind of the realm of fantasy. But now we're entering the period of early science fiction. So Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, a lot of these people who have grown up, certainly with a lot of the romantic stuff that we're talking about, are now immersed in this new scientific literature and this new scientific understanding of the vastness of things. And that is being imaged in very specific and interesting ways. So, we're thinking about things like all the moon exploration that comes up certainly in the novels of Jules Verne and the way that's being illustrated. The light that people are experiencing is not the light of the earth. It's the light, seen from other worlds or on other worlds. This is wonderful. This is an 1873 illustration by James Naismith titled Aspect of an Eclipse of the Sun by the Earth as it would appear as seen from the moon. So I want to point that out. We have now moved totally off the Earth. So think of before, we might have been under the Earth in Pandemonium before, but now we're literally on the moon. And so we're entering this extraterrestrial luminous space. So I want to end with this because, as I've said, late Romanticism, the end of the 19th century, is also the period of the rise of science fiction. And if we're thinking about the luminous void, the luminous abyss, which has been such a part of the Romantic tradition of thinking about the glow of what's out there and how what's out there can overwhelm us with its energy and force and power. As we start to move into outer space, or as outer space starts to come to us, a lot of these tropes persist. So case in point, I've already mentioned H.P. Lovecraft's The Color Out of Space, but Arthur Conan Doyle and also M.P. Shiel, another writer of the period, are actually writing whole novels about how things like luminous clouds, right, are coming towards the earth, the purple cloud, the poison belt. I think there's even a description in War of the Worlds of some kind of a gas. I think that isn't there like a luminous green gas? Well, that actually shows up in Dracula as well, right? But it's very interesting. So as I say, I am so intrigued by the way that a through line can be traced. And that's certainly something that we're going to do every week in the Gothic Cosmos. We'll start in the middle of the 18th century at the time of Horace Walpole. But if you attend both halves, we're going to end up with Weimar cinema and also the modern Goth movement coming out of the 70s and the 80s. At any rate, thanks so much for coming to this lecture. I know it's a lot of information, but I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you also found some of it useful for your own creative work. And I hope that some of you will join me for the Gothic Cosmos Part I. And first class will be February 1st. So thanks again. Thanks to Morbid Anatomy. And I look forward to seeing old friends and making new ones as we explore all things Gothic. Thank you.